Hey, can you name this tune? Da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da. Do you remember it from the 80s, the final countdown? Well, it's the final countdown on today's Cornerstone Connection. My name is Nate Carter, and now that's probably about the end of the upbeat part of this connection, because really it's the last couple of days before Jesus goes to the cross. And we see during the final countdown here that on one side, Jesus is preparing for the most important event in human history, and on the other side, the leading priests and teachers of the law are preparing to do the most evil they can possibly think of. And both are happening simultaneously. Take a look with me at Matthew chapter 26. In verse 3, we see, first of all, at the same time, the leading priests and elders were meeting at the residence of Caiaphas, the high priest, plotting how to capture Jesus secretly and kill him. So, plotting to do evil. Later on, Jesus is anointed at Bethany by this woman, and he says to her in verse 12, he says, "She has poured this perfume on me to prepare my body for burial." So this woman is helping to prepare Jesus for his death at the same time that the priests and teachers of the law are preparing to kill Jesus. And then Judas, we find, is preparing as well. It's his final countdown as well. Judas Iscariot, in verse 14, went to the leading priests and asked, "How much will you pay me to betray Jesus to you?" And they agreed on 30 pieces of silver. He is also preparing during this final countdown. But then Jesus, in this wonderful scene, it's the Last Supper, we see that he's preparing to reveal to the disciples what the cross is going to mean. And just listen to these familiar words, verse 26. As they were eating, Jesus took some bread and blessed it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, "Take this and eat it, for this is my body." And he took a cup of wine and gave thanks to God for it. He gave it to them and said, "Each of you drink from it, for this is my blood, which confirms the covenant between God and his people. It is poured out as a sacrifice to forgive the sins of many." Jesus is preparing. Later, he continues his preparation as he and the disciples go to Gethsemane. In verse 36, Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." And then in 39, he went on a little further and bowed with his face to the ground, praying. Now, Jesus is preparing for his betrayal. He's preparing to go to the cross. And so what does he find as an important act? He's going to pray. Before this huge, momentous event, he needs to be with the Father one more time. And listen to the words that he prays. "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup of suffering be taken away from me. Yet I want your will to be done and not mine." So fascinating that Jesus knows that it needs to happen, but wishes that it wouldn't have to. He's got a spirit of dread here about what's about to happen to him. I just find it's very interesting that in this passage of Scripture, it's a rather lengthy one, we see the combination of the forces of good, ultimate good, and the forces of evil working, plotting, planning at the same time for the same event. Both are expecting different outcomes. Jesus would have to die either way, but the leading priests would see it as a victory for getting Jesus out of their life, out of their hair. Jesus sees it as a victory for all of humanity, for sins to be forgiven. We're in our Old Testament reading, we're about to go and visit Joseph, and we're going to hear Joseph at the end of his whole ordeal say these words, that what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And that's just such the way that God works, isn't it? That here is the ultimate evil, that the one perfect person that ever walked the earth should be the one who's condemned to die. And yet, this ultimate evil, God all along planned for good. And during this chapter, we see the preparations going into that. Just this week, we learned about a couple of mass shootings in California. And I find myself praying that prayer. God, what these people meant for evil, may you turn it somehow to good. And we don't know on this side how God's going to do that, but we know that that's the business that God works in. He turns what looks like the worst evil into things that are good for his plan, and he can be trusted for that. I don't know what's going on in your life, but perhaps you are foreseeing some evil times ahead, or some painful times ahead, some difficult times ahead. But as you go, know that God is in the business of turning evil into good. It's promised throughout the scriptures, and it's the promise that we can keep with us as well. This is the ultimate example. The cross was meant to be an instrument of absolute evil. God turned it into an instrument of absolute good. So hold on to that promise today. Carry it with you. Be encouraged. And we'll see you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.